All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're diving headfirst into a topic that I'm sure we've all encountered before, that moment when you launch an A/B test and something just feels off.
Yeah, definitely a relatable struggle for anyone who's spent time in the A/B testing trenches.
It's like that feeling when your traffic is splitting in a way that makes you question if you set things up correctly.
Right, like are we really getting a good comparison here? Makes you second guess everything.
Exactly. So, to help us unravel this all-too-common A/B testing head-scratcher, we're taking a deep dive into sample ratio mismatch. And to guide us on this journey, we've got this super helpful support article from Webtrends Optimize.
It's a really handy resource for anyone using the platform. This sample ratio mismatch thing, it's actually a more common issue than people might think.
Yeah.
And it really gets at the heart of why we do A/B testing in the first place to make sure our data is reliable.
Totally. Because if
But
your sample sizes are way off, then your results are basically meaningless.
exactly. It's like trying to figure out which fruit people prefer, but you're offering one group a big bowl of ripe apples and the other group, well, just a couple of bruised oranges.
Okay, that's a delicious analogy. And it highlights why getting those sample ratios right is crucial. But before we jump into troubleshooting, the article makes an important point about debunking a common myth. We won't always see a perfect 50-50 traffic split in our tests.
Right, and that can be a bit unnerving for folks new to A/B testing or even those of us who just need a little reminder sometimes.
It's easy to get hung up on those numbers being exactly even.
It makes sense. We like things to be balanced. But remember, it's all based on randomization. Think of it like flipping a coin a bunch of times. You might end up with a few more heads than tails, even though the odds should, theoretically, even out.
So when do we actually need to start worrying? How much variation is too much?
That's the million-dollar question, right? This deep dive is really focused on those times when you see a truly glaring discrepancy, like if one variation is getting 90% of the traffic and the other one is stuck at a measly 10%.
Okay, so let's say we're staring at our data and those alarm bells are definitely going off. Where do we even start to untangle this mess?
The article lays out a really nice step-by-step approach to troubleshooting, which I think is so valuable when you're dealing with something that has the potential to be complex.
Everyone loves a good roadmap.
Right. It gives you a place to start. And in this case, it all begins with the most fundamental question. Is there actually any traffic flowing into your test at all?
So we're starting with the basics.
Always a good place to start, because if there's no traffic whatsoever, that points to a much bigger issue with how you've set things up. Like, is the test even running correctly?
Right, it's like sending out invitations to a party, but then forgetting to include the actual address.
Yeah.
No one's going to show up.
Exactly. And this is where having tools like the Force Experiment widget and the staging mode within Webtrends Optimize can be real lifesavers. It's like doing a test run before the actual event.
So we can make sure everything's working as it should be without any surprises.
Precisely. You can confirm that your test is running on the right pages, that the right audience is seeing it, all those crucial details before you open the floodgates and start collecting real data.
Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for a world of confusion later on. But let's say some traffic IS trickling in, but one variation is looking awfully empty compared to the other. What could be going on in that scenario?
All right, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty. One very common culprit is that your segmentation logic is off.
Segmentation logic. Remind me what that means again.
Of course, that's just a fancy way of saying the rules you set up to decide who sees which version of the test.
Oh, right. Like, if we're testing a new checkout flow, but we accidentally exclude users who have items in their cart already.
Perfect example. Those users with items in their cart would never even see the new checkout flow, no matter how many times they visited the site. They wouldn't even enter the test bucket.
And we might not even realize it unless we were really paying attention. It's so easy to overlook those little things, even when you think you've planned everything out carefully.
It really is. That's why rigorous testing is so crucial at this stage. Luckily, Webtrends Optimize has a dedicated debug mode where you can basically see exactly how those segments are being evaluated. It's like having X-ray vision into your test setup.
Love that analogy. And speaking of things that are invisible to the naked eye, sometimes the culprit behind a wonky sample ratio mismatch is a sneaky JavaScript error lurking in your code.
JavaScript errors, they can be a real pain, that's for sure.
What's so tricky about them?
Well, the thing is, even a tiny little error in your JavaScript can actually prevent Webtrends from counting a user as having seen a particular test variation.
Wait, so one little typo could potentially throw off my whole experiment.
Yep, it's true. It seems small, but it's actually a really important safeguard that Webtrends has in place. Basically, it's all about protecting the integrity of your data. Well, if a user doesn't actually experience the test variation the way they're supposed to because of an error, then their behavior isn't going to accurately reflect the changes you're testing. So Webtrends says, nope, we're not going to count that data point because it's unreliable.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But how on earth are we supposed to know if these JavaScript gremlins are hiding out in our code?
Time to put on our detective hats. Webtrends provide some pretty great tools for this as well. Remember that debug mode we talked about earlier?
They're like X-ray vision?
Exactly.
Huh.
Well, it also has different verbosity levels that you can adjust.
Verbosity levels. That sounds intense.
It's not as scary as it sounds. Basically, verbosity just refers to how much detail you see in those debug logs. Think of it like choosing the strength of your morning coffee.
Okay, I like where this is going.
So, basic debug mode, that's like your regular cup of coffee. It gives you a decent overview, but if you really want to dig deep and see what's going on, you can crank up the verbosity, and now you've got yourself an espresso, a much stronger dose of information.
I can feel my heart racing already.
And that granular view can be super crucial because sometimes those JavaScript errors will be browser specific.
You mean my test could be working perfectly fine on my laptop, but it's totally broken on someone's phone?
You got it. Or even device specific. And without digging into those detailed debug logs, you might never know that these errors are happening for some users and totally skewing your results.
Wow, so we could be missing a huge piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. And that's just one example. Redirects can also really mess with your sample ratios, especially if they're not implemented super carefully.
Redirects, like when you click a link and it almost instantly sends you to a different page before you even have time to process it.
Exactly. If a redirect isn't set up to play nicely with Webtrends Optimize, it can actually interrupt the whole tracking process. So from Webtrends' perspective, it might seem like a user never even saw that test variation in the first place.
So someone could be getting diverted before they're even counted toward the sample size, messing up the numbers without us realizing it.
Yep, it's like showing up to a party, starting to sign the guest list, but then getting whisked away to the buffet line before you can finish writing your name. You're technically there, but you didn't get recorded properly.
Okay, those are some vivid analogies.
Yeah.
But seriously, how do we keep those redirect rebels in check?
Event hooks are your new best friend.
Event hooks? Tell me more.
Think of them like those velvet ropes they use at fancy events to kind of manage the flow of people. You can strategically place these event hooks to make sure that the tracking happens at exactly the right moment before any redirects have a chance to occur.
So we're not just randomly tossing people into test variations anymore. We're being way more deliberate about how and when they enter the experience.
Exactly. And that level of control can make a world of difference when it comes to the reliability of your data. And we've only just started scratching the surface here. We've covered sneaky segmentation errors, those invisible JavaScript gremlins, and even redirect disruptions. But there's one more head scratcher that the article mentions that I want to get your take on. Sometimes the control group actually ends up smaller than the variation, which seems kind of counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, it does. That all seems backwards.
Right. It's definitely less common, but it does happen. And the funny thing is, it often boils down to errors in the code for the control group itself.
So instead of something being wrong with the variation, it's the control group that we've accidentally messed up.
Precisely. And it highlights how crucial it is to be just as meticulous about testing the code for all variations, including that baseline control, as you are about testing the new stuff. Otherwise, you risk sabotaging your own experiment.
It's like accidentally tripping yourself at the starting line. Okay, this is already eye-opening, and we've only just begun to explore this whole world of sample ratio mismatch. We'll be back in a bit to dig into even more insights from the article. Don't go anywhere.
This podcast is brought to you by Webtrends Optimize, a leader in A/B testing and personalization, with an all-inclusive commercial model that gives all users access to powerful features like full stack, social proofing, and recommendations. Learn more at webtrends-optimize.com.
It's like we're setting ourselves up for failure before we even begin. Thorough testing, definitely adding that to my to-do list. But before we get too lost in the weeds of code debugging, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about analyzing results by user versus by session. For those of us who might need a little refresher course, can you break down that distinction again?
Absolutely. And it's an important one, especially in the world of A/B testing. So think of a user as a unique individual who's visiting your website, kind of like everyone has their own unique fingerprint.
Right, makes sense.
Okay, so then a session is simply one visit by that user.
So one user could have multiple sessions if they visit the website multiple times, like throughout the day.
Exactly. You might be browsing a website, you get distracted, you leave, you come back later. That's two separate sessions, but you're still the same user. You're just returning to the site.
Gotcha. Makes sense. But why is this distinction so important in the context of, like, analyzing our A/B test results?
Because of the way that Webtrends Optimize works, once a user is assigned to a specific variation in your test, they're going to stick with that variation, even if they leave the website and come back later. We call that a sticky experience.
So even if I have multiple sessions, I'm always counted as part of that same original group that I was assigned to.
Exactly. So this is where analyzing things by session can actually get a little misleading. Let's say you've got a variation that seems super popular at first glance because it has a really high session count.
So more people are landing on that version of the page initially, right?
Right. But then when you dig a little deeper and you actually look at the user data, you might find that there are actually fewer unique individuals who are sticking around long term with that variation.
Interesting. So it could be that those high session numbers are just coming from a smaller group of people who are returning more frequently for some reason.
Precisely. And that reason could be that they're confused, they're frustrated, they keep coming back because something isn't working quite right and they're trying to figure it out.
So it's like the difference between judging a restaurant based on how crowded it is on a Friday night versus how many people become regulars and keep coming back week after week.
That's a great analogy. It's all about understanding those long-term patterns. And looking at the USER data gives you a much more accurate picture of the long-term impact of the changes you're testing.
It's not just about that initial spike. It's about who's sticking around for the long haul.
Exactly. Are you attracting more users with this variation? Are those users engaged? Are they coming back for more? Those are the real questions we want to answer.
That's why I love these deep dives. We're uncovering insights that I wouldn't have even thought to look for otherwise.
And we're not done yet. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about common culprits like segmentation errors, those sneaky JavaScript issues, even those times when the control group itself might actually be the problem.
Right. And we've learned about the importance of using the right tools for the job, like that debug mode with those adjustable verbosity settings, which, I'm not going to lie, still sounds a little intimidating.
Don't worry, it's not as complicated as it might sound at first. It's really just about understanding the level of detail you need to see in order to solve the problem at hand. Think of it like choosing the zoom level on a map, right?
Okay, I like that.
Sometimes you need to zoom in really close to see those street level details, and sometimes you just need that bird's eye view to get your bearings.
So if those basic troubleshooting steps aren't giving us the answers we're looking for, we can always crank up the verbosity and get a more granular look at what's happening behind the scenes.
Precisely. But before you go down that rabbit hole, don't underestimate the power of reaching out for help. Webtrends has a fantastic support team. They've probably seen it all when it comes to these kinds of A/B testing quirks.
That's a good reminder. Even the most experienced data detectives sometimes need a little backup. Sometimes it takes a village. But even with all the right tools and, a little help from our friends, tackling this whole sample ratio mismatch thing, it can feel a bit like navigating a maze, right?
Absolutely. There are twists and turns and dead ends, and it's really all about, learning how to read the clues, rule out the things that aren't actually the problem, and just methodically working your way through the possibilities.
And that's what I really appreciate about this Webtrends article that we're using as our guide today. It really gives us that clear structure. So instead of feeling overwhelmed and intimidated, we can approach these problems strategically and feel empowered to actually solve them.
I love that. Because knowledge is power, right? Especially when we're dealing with something as complex as A/B testing. We've debunked some myths today. We've dug into common pitfalls. And I think we've even had a few of those aha moments.
I'm all about those aha moments.
Yeah.
Like realizing that just because a variation has a really high section count doesn't automatically mean it's a winner. It could just mean that those users are getting lost or frustrated and clicking around more, which isn't really the goal.
Right. And it just highlights why it's so important to always look beyond those surface level numbers and think critically about the bigger picture. Are we actually achieving the outcomes we want? Are we genuinely improving the user experience? Those are the questions we should be asking.
The million-dollar questions.
Yeah.
And it sounds like this whole sample ratio mismatch thing can really throw a wrench into those answers if we're not careful.
Oh, absolutely. But by understanding these potential pitfalls and having a solid troubleshooting process in place, we're setting ourselves up for success. We can dramatically increase our chances of running A/B tests that actually give us those reliable, clear, actionable results we're looking for.
Music to my ears. So next time our listeners are digging into Webtrends Optimize and they see those traffic numbers looking a little wonky, what's the key takeaway they should remember?
Don't panic. Take a deep breath, channel your inner data detective, and just remember the steps we've talked about today. Start with the basics, double check your setup, make sure everything's firing correctly, use those debugging tools to your advantage. And don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it. Webtrends support. They're there for a reason.
It's true, we've all been there. So as we wrap up this deep dive into sample ratio mismatch, I want to say a huge thank you for joining us today and for, being brave enough to confront those A/B testing gremlins head on.
It's been a pleasure diving into this with you. Hopefully our listeners are feeling a little more prepared and a lot less intimidated by their next A/B testing adventure.
Absolutely. Until next time, happy testing, everyone.
And that's it for this episode of Test World. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard, feel free to check out more episodes on our channel. And if you want to learn more, head over to webtrends-optimize.com or check out our other podcast, The Big Lift. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.